Hi, I'm Don, and welcome back to the Music Breakdown. And this marks the return of the Retrospective series, Artist Retrospectives, Discography Reviews. Today I've got Led Zeppelin, the legendary hard rock band from the late 60s and 70s. Led Zeppelin is a band who really needs no introduction, seeing as they are one of the most popular and acclaimed and best-selling rock acts of all time. And I think certainly in the realm of hard rock, Led Zeppelin kind of reigns supreme as perhaps one of the most, if not the most, creative band that the genre has to offer. Not to mention the way they shaped the genre as we know it today, and the way that they shaped other genres like heavy metal. And while the topic is marred with controversy, given the fact that the band often did not credit the musicians they blatantly took ideas and even songs from, I do think there's no denying the transformative nature of what Led Zeppelin did to these songs and to these styles. And anyway, they're one of my favorite all-time bands, so I think we should really just get into talking about their discography, starting with their 1969 debut, Led Zeppelin. For a debut, this album is really a powerhouse. Led Zeppelin came right out of the gate with their unique blend of hard rock, heavy psych, folk, and blues in a way stronger than, frankly, a lot of the material they would put out later. This album isn't just a raw display of the band's ideas, it is immediately a display of their talent, not only instrumentally, but also just the overall loudness of the sound. It's just something you don't really hear from a lot of 60s bands. And it's that loudness that I think really defines Led Zeppelin 1, because if there is one thing I will say about this album that it has over really all of the other ones in their catalog, it is just how loud it is. It grants them a rawness that I think is well suited to a debut like this, but also it just emphasizes the power of the band. It's almost like this band is so loud that the album format cannot even contain them. It also, importantly, is a pretty versatile record. They really blend all of their influences that they would continue to work with throughout their career into this record. Out of their catalog, Led Zeppelin I is one of the most indebted records to the blues, if not the most. And I say that because it contains tracks like You Shook Me and I Can't Quit You, Baby, which are both just blues songs. But these tracks do display the band's unique take on blues and the heaviness of their blues that I think sets it apart. However, I will say I don't think these tracks are quite as transformative to blues as later Led Zeppelin tracks. They still serve a great foundation for this record. They're sort of like the anchor that the album sits on, though they are my least favorite tracks. But the rest of the track list is fireworks. I mean, it really is. The opener, Good Times, Bad Times, is explosive. It just opens the record up with such force. And even with that said, it's a legitimately fun song. It's not heavy to the point where it's off-putting to anybody. It's really, a pretty poppy track, and it's very catchy. But John Bonham's drums right at the start here, mixed with the guitar, it's fantastic. And then Babe, I'm Gonna Leave You initially seems like the band's attempt at making folk, and it does have that influence to it, but this song might be the loudest on the whole record. When the guitars and riffs really come in, it's apocalyptic. I think that the band's songwriting isn't completely honed on this album, but it kind of works to the record's benefit. For example, Dazed and Confused as a song is a little bit scattered. There are a lot of extra sections that don't really need to be there, but that's kind of what makes the song so great. It feels very progressive. It really does a lot. And because of that, the song feels like a journey. And I would say that for a number of songs on the record. Like, the songs themselves may not be the most focused, but that allows the band to jam out and experiment a little bit. And all of that stuff is really a treat on this album. But anyway, back to Dazed and Confused. This song is one of the heaviest songs you can hear from its entire era. Like, one of the heaviest songs of the 60s, and most likely the heaviest song Led Zeppelin ever put to tape. The riff is so huge, and I especially love the moments before this riff enters where the guitar and the drums all just come crashing down. It's crazy. This is such a hype song. It is sublime. And speaking of heavy tracks, the closer, How Many More Times, is another great example. This song reminds me quite a bit of Jimi Hendrix, actually. Just in the way that the song progresses, it sounds like something that could have been on Electric Ladyland. And yeah, the riff on this one is such a stomper, and it's especially awesome when it returns after the long psychedelic jam. I love the unpredictability of that track, another song that just really feels like a journey. Yeah, I really have very few negative things to say about the debut Led Zeppelin album. I think it's one of their best, and I would give it a 9.25 out of 10. Which is going to move us into discussing the next album that the band released the same year as their debut, which is Led Zeppelin II. And I really should get my bias out of the way right now and just say that Led Zeppelin II is my favorite Led Zeppelin record. To me, it is their strongest set of songs, not just because they are comparatively more straightforward to stuff that they would do on some later albums, but also because they're simultaneously not really straightforward. A lot of these songs go in interesting directions. I think the band's sense of making their songs into journeys that we saw on some tracks on Led Zeppelin 1 continues on to Led Zeppelin 2, but the band's songwriting has really tightened up, so it allows every single song to be a lot more of a package in itself, to the point where I would say almost every track on this album could easily have been a single. The band's fondness for blues is equally as noticeable on Led Zeppelin II, but I feel like they work this into every song in a better way. I think the main thing this album owes to the blues, aside from some of the more bluesy tracks, is the lyrical cliches of blues. Like, lyrically, this is a blues record through and through. And something I didn't even mention on Led Zeppelin 1 is how amazing Robert Plant is as a singer. And I probably should have mentioned it there, but this album, for me, Led Zeppelin 2, gives some of his strongest moments. There are quite a few songs on this album where Robert Plant just adds so much, like the all-time classic Whole Lotta Love. I love Plant's performance on this song so much. But the song is really a showcase for everybody's talents. I mean, the riff, obviously, is amazing, and the drumming is spectacular. And something I really like about the track that also carries through some of this track list is just how, like, weird it gets sometimes. Like, I find it very strange how Whole Lotta Love is such a huge single for the band, and yet, like, a minute of it is dedicated to just this weird psychedelic freak out. And the way the band works this in and how they return to the song after it, it's incredible. Instrumentally on Led Zeppelin 2, I think the band is sounding a lot tighter than they were on Led Zeppelin 1 overall. And the members are able to show off more. I mean, John Paul Jones really shows off on the bass all over the Lemon song. It's awesome. Jimmy Page gets the guitar solo on Heartbreaker, which is epic. And then you have the drum solo, Moby Dick, which is really awesome. It's just goofy. Like, it's not the most technically impressive drum solo you've ever heard, but it's so entertaining. Like, it just feels like John Bonham is just doing a bunch of crap on his drums, and it's so fun to listen to. I think the song Ramble On showcases the band's folk inclinations in a really solid way. You know, that's another thing that was there in Led Zeppelin 1, but here on Ramble On, once again, it just feels like a more single-ready package. And Ramble On just has such a fantastic dynamic between these folky verses and the explosive, catchy chorus, which is something I would also say about What Is and What Should Never Be. That chorus, when that hits, it just puts such a smile on my face, as well as like the second half of the tune where suddenly the song keeps going and it turns into a completely different riff. That always just blows my mind. You also have the spectacular Heartbreaker, which is broken up by a crazy guitar solo break. And I will say that when the only instrument you hear is Jimmy Page's guitar, you can hear him up a few of the notes, but you know what? I will totally excuse it. When the rest of the band joins in with this solo, it's crazy, and the song has an amazing riff. Really, I mean, almost all the songs on this record have amazing riffs, and my favorite of which is on the closer, Bring It On Home, which opens as a send-up to the original blues song. It's kind of goofy. You don't really know where it's going, and it doesn't really feel like anything special is going to happen until suddenly the band explodes into the most face-melting riff of their entire career. And honestly, Bring It On Home is in contention for my favorite Led Zeppelin track. This whole album is awesome. Like, as a hard rock album, it hits all the beats you'd want it to, but it does so much more than that. It maintains the versatility that the band showed on their debut, but hones it into a more single-ready set of songs. Like, I could pick any track off of this and listen to it on its own, and it still holds up. Like, really, it does everything you could want from an album like this, and I would give it a 10. And now it's time to discuss Led Zeppelin's third album from 1970, that is Led Zeppelin III. This is an interesting record because it's the band's attempt to show that they can do more with their music than what they showed you on Led Zeppelin I and II. And so the band forays into folk and acoustic music much more on this album than on the previous two. And while that aspect of the band had been explored a little bit, Led Zeppelin III opens the door much, much further. Side 1 contains more what you would expect from Led Zeppelin up to this point, opening on the iconic Immigrant song. This riff is just so awesome to start the album with. It sounds so cool. And the song is a lot more mystical than a lot of the material that landed on the last two records. I think this album really starts to hint at the more fantastical imagery that the band is going to try to conjure up on the next few records than the first two albums do. And it feels like, in a lot of ways, this album is beginning to leave blues behind. Although, don't get me wrong, it's still a very core aspect of the sound. There are some other hard-rocking cuts on this first side, those being Celebration Day and Out on the Tiles, but one thing I will say is that I think the songwriting is not as strong on really any of these cuts as it is on 2 or even certain pockets of 1. For me, all of these tracks, honestly, including Immigrant Song, lose steam at a certain point. They don't feel like completely fully realized tracks. I don't think this is where the band's head was at on this album. I don't think this was the material they were really excited to create. And you can kind of tell, but again, these are all solid tracks. Immigrant Song in particular, it's still a great song. The blues number, Since I've Been Loving You, is really the standout of this side and the standout of this entire record. Because the song is so lifting, it's so beautiful, it's so impressive. The 7-minute blues cut with so many peaks and valleys all throughout it. It blossoms into a beautiful flower during the chorus. It's a glorious track, and I think probably one of the best Led Zeppelin songs. But this isn't really something I can say for a lot of the rest of the record, and honestly, side 2, which is the entirely acoustic side, they go completely acoustic on side 2. And, despite the fact that I think this was what the band was really trying to do on this whole album, I feel like side 2 falls a bit flat. I love Gallows Pole. I think that song is awesome. But I think after that song, I don't know. I know Tangerine is a fan favorite. It just doesn't feel like the strongest track to me. The song isn't all too special to my ears, but, it's nice. But it's really the last 3 tracks that drag this whole album down for me, because while That's the Way has a pretty sounding acoustic guitar, it's also like 5.5 minutes long. It's just not really that interesting of a folk tune. And the last 2 tracks just feel like such a letdown. Brunny or Stomp, it sounds bad. The production on this track is not good. It sounds like a random jam, and it's just not a very special song. But then the closer, Hats Off to Roy Harper, just bizarre. It's like some stupid joke track, but it goes on for like almost 4 minutes, and it leaves such a sour taste in my mouth at the end of this album. So, Led Zeppelin III is clearly my least favorite of these 3 records, and actually by a substantial margin, though I do still like the album. I think the main thing that makes Led Zeppelin III cool is that it sets the band up to do more things in the future. And they really capitalize on a lot of the sounds and ideas that they were toying with on this record. But, after this point, the albums aren't so segmented. This album feels like it's kind of caught between 2 worlds, and it's not really blending them all too well together. And that's definitely not helped by the fact that there's an entire side which is purely acoustic. It makes the album feel kind of disjointed, and there are some songs on here I just don't care for too much. All that said, though, I do still enjoy Led Zeppelin III. I would give it a 7. And that moves us on to the next album, which is technically untitled, but often referred to as Led Zeppelin IV from 1971. While Led Zeppelin II is my favorite Led Zeppelin record, I think it is safe to say that in many ways Led Zeppelin IV is the band's best work. Led Zeppelin IV does what Led Zeppelin III couldn't do, and it blends this adventurous, mystical, fantastical acoustic sound into the band's hard rock sound and creates a track list which somehow makes the two work perfectly together. All of the songs in this album really feel like they exist in the same world, whether that's the anthemic call and response hard rock of Black Dog or the folk journey of Battle of Evermore. These two songs could not be more different, and yet on Led Zeppelin IV, they feel like they are living in the same place. And I think instrumentally, the band got tighter and tighter as their catalog moved along. But by Led Zeppelin IV, the band is playing as a unit as good as they ever will. And notably, I really want to shout out Plant's vocals on this record because it's his peak. It's easily his peak. His voice still sounds great on this album, and I think after this point, I think he'd kind of done a number on his voice. We'll get to it, but anyway, with this album, he sounds incredible. He does so many things with his voice on this album to really transform these songs into something so much more than they would have been otherwise. Like, he is such an important element to the mix of Led Zeppelin IV, but so is everybody, really. This album just feels more progressive than their previous work. It feels like the band is making more of an artistic statement with this record, and that doesn't come at the expense of fun songs like Rock and Roll. That song could fit on a playlist right alongside songs like Whole Lotta Love and Good Times, Bad Times, and whatever else. You know, it rocks hard. But at the same time, you get songs like Four Sticks and Stairway to Heaven, which feel like they're pushing the band's sound into a completely new place. And I think it goes without saying that Stairway to Heaven is perhaps the defining moment of Led Zeppelin's entire catalog. I mean, certainly I think this is their most lasting song, and for very, very good reason, because it is a beautiful track. The journey of this song is stronger than probably any other Led Zeppelin song. It's so satisfying, it's so climactic, and lyrically it's easily one of their strongest as well. The song captures such vivid imagery, but it's, you know, so up for interpretation. Like, I don't even think they really knew what the song meant as they wrote these words, but you can apply them to your life in whatever way you want and it'll work. It's a beautiful track and really stands as the centerpiece of this entire album. The band also starts to incorporate keyboards on a few tracks here. You have Misty Mountain Hop with the amazing electric keys. The song is so bouncy and fun, and really it's the perfect track to follow up Stairway to Heaven, opening up side 2. Then also on Four Sticks, there are moments where the odd groove of the song really clicks together with a synthesizer, and these moments are euphoric. And I should also make mention of the way piano is used at the end of Rock and Roll. I find this to be one of the best moments in their career. When that piano comes crashing in on this song, it's so awesome. Finally, the closer, When the Levee Breaks, is another one of the strongest moments on any Led Zeppelin album. Not just because this is one of their best songs, but I think as a closer, it feels so world-ending. Like, if the whole album was building this fantasy hard rock world, whatever that might mean, When the Levee Breaks is destroying it, just collapsing it before your ears. The song is huge, it is earth-shattering, and it's just so awesome. And it really might be like the peak of the heaviness that Led Zeppelin could bring to blues. It's a blues song at its core, but it barely sounds like one. And the last thing I think I need to make note of with Led Zeppelin IV is the production, which this is the best produced Led Zeppelin album, in my opinion. This album sounds incredible. It sounds pristine. It holds up to this day easily. Every sound and every detail is sat perfectly in the mix. You really just get to sit in the center of it and absorb every sound that Led Zeppelin brings. I think this album is phenomenal. It might not have my absolute favorite Led Zeppelin track list, but I do think that in many ways it is their strongest. I would give it a 9.75. And now with Led Zeppelin IV very much feeling like the culmination of everything the band had been leading up to that point, it's hard to know where to go from here. But the band went to 1973's Houses of the Holy. Houses of the Holy is surely a more experimental record than any Led Zeppelin up to this point. I mean, the band experimented a lot on Led Zeppelin IV, but arguably even more so on Houses of the Holy. The band does some pretty weird stuff on this record. I think they go in a direction that you wouldn't really have expected them to. There are some genre experiments on this album. There are more progressive songs than there even were on 4. And I think the band was really making more of an attempt to branch out, which is extremely commendable, because they'd already done enough at this point. And Houses of the Holy is yet another massive success, in my opinion. It is just about as good as the last record. Opening track, the song remains the same, has more momentum than probably any other Led Zeppelin song. I've rarely heard a rock song with as much forward momentum as this song has. And it also just has a really unique vibe. It feels like a dream. Like it's a very dreamy hard rock track. It's weird to think that's possible. It's something about the guitar tone on this track coupled with Robert Plant's extremely weird vocals on this song. He sounds like a dying cat on this track, and it works. It just sounds so surreal and strange. But the song still absolutely goes. And I think following this track up with the Rain song was a genius moment of sequencing here. Because the Rain song, I feel like, is sort of an attempt to do another Stairway to Heaven, and it's pretty much just as good. And this is really where Led Zeppelin's usage of synthesizers is at its peak. The Rain song is benefited so much from the keys and the mellotron. It is a gorgeous soundscape that the song has, and I love how much of a build there is before the song really gets going. And when it does, there are some tracks in this album that feel like fairly standard Led Zeppelin fare up to this point. You have Over the Hills and Far Away, which feels like the culmination of what they were trying to do on Led Zeppelin III. To me, this blending of folk and hard rock, they come together perfectly on this track. But I think even in a lot of these moments where they're treading on hard rock territory they might have already treaded on, they do it in just a more interesting way. Like with the closing track, The Ocean. The time signature on this song is so odd, and yet the band plays the song so straight, like you hardly even notice it. The riff just works so well, it kind of skips along in a bit of a weird pace, but it sounds rad. It's like the band is just flexing their musicianship on this record in a lot of ways, showing their more progressive artistic tendencies, but showing that they can do it like it's nothing. When it comes to genre experiments, you get the funk track, the Crunge. I mean, it's kind of a funk track. It's a really weird song. It feels like a joke. But like the more I listen to it, the more I enjoy the weirdness of it, the more I enjoy the stupidity of it. And it does have like a serious groove to it. It's a really weird song, but I like how it turned out. And then you have Dear Maker, which is their attempt at making reggae. A bit of an ill-fated experiment in some ways, maybe. But the songwriting on this track is so strong. It's such a catchy, nice song, and the way they blend hard rock into this song in the chorus, it's fantastic. And you get the band venturing into all-out progressive rock with No Quarter, which sounds like a Pink Floyd song, honestly. It's so spacious and fairly mellow. The way they blend the keyboard and the guitar on this track is awesome. So this album is one of the weirdest in the Led Zeppelin discography in a lot of ways, but I think that's one of the things that makes me love it. And besides, it really features all of the great aspects of the band that we've heard up to this point in a completely new way. For me, it's the last Led Zeppelin album that really feels like the band had boundless creativity. Like nothing was stopping them. They felt like they could do anything, and they'd put it on a record. I'm going to give this one another 9.75. This remains one of my favorites to this day. And next up is Led Zeppelin's 1975 double album, Physical Graffiti, which was the first to be released on the band's own label, Swan Song. I am a bit conflicted with Physical Graffiti. I think this is a strong album, undoubtedly. It remains a part of the classic run of Led Zeppelin, which it also marks the end of. But the album still has the band pressing forward in a new direction in certain spots. For one thing, I think this album is a lot more influenced by dance music. You could almost call it dance rock. I mean, the way they play some of these songs, it feels like it's all about just a tight groove. Some of the best examples of that are the songs Custard Pie and Trampled Underfoot. And it also has like the chunkiest sound of any Led Zeppelin album. The guitar and the drums, they sound so thick on this record, but not in like a heavy way. It's weird, it's hard to describe. It's very boomy, is probably how I describe it. And I think it works mostly, but the production does grate a little bit for me over the course of the entire runtime, although it works on some tracks beautifully. Double albums tend to be a place where an artist can experiment and throw every idea they have at the wall. But I don't really think Led Zeppelin did that on Physical Graffiti. They do in points. Like you have the career all-timer Kashmir, which is this mystical journey of a song, utilizing symphonic elements to create a truly spectacular cinematic song. And with how adventurous this song is, as well as, the adventurous length of the song In My Time of Dying, which is this long, jammy blues track, you would think that Led Zeppelin was really going to make this one of their most adventurous albums. But I feel like, not really. And it's fine. Like, that's fine. I think the band is good enough to justify it. And, there aren't a lot of, weak tracks in this album for the most part. We'll get to the final side in a second. But the problem is Robert Plant. I don't think he tried very hard on a lot of this album, and maybe he did, but if he did, I think his voice was just giving out. For me, up until this point, Robert Plant has pretty much been my favorite member of Led Zeppelin. I think that Plant's vocals do the most for me of any aspect of Led Zeppelin's sound. But from this album and onward, he's easily my least favorite member. He is contributing the least to the band, and he is actively making the band worse. I don't know. There are songs on here where he does a great job, Kashmir obviously being one of them, but there are a lot where he doesn't. And I think whoever mixed this album knew that, because Robert Plant's vocals tend to be a little bit quieter on this album than they were on the last few. So I think that they were aware he wasn't contributing a ton. Anyway, that coupled with the production of this record starts to get grating for me over the whole runtime and makes the second disc of this album a bit more of a chore. I think disc 1 is great. Disc 1 I can listen to in its totality and love it. Disc 2, though, there aren't really any standouts for me on this album. I know a lot of people would list 10 Years Gone as a highlight from Physical Graffiti. To me, the song has interesting ideas in the guitar work, but it feels a bit aimless. And then you have the epic In the Light, which doesn't feel very epic. It doesn't really feel like the progression of this song is all that exciting. I don't know. It falls kind of flat on its face. It sets itself up to be some big epic track, and then they kind of just repeat the same 3 sections 2 times, and frankly, none of them are that great. But I still like these tracks, right? Disc 2, I still like all these tracks. I think they're solid. It's really side D where Physical Graffiti, I think, completely falls apart. Night Flight and Wonton Song are good songs. But the last 3 tracks of Physical Graffiti, one thing I haven't mentioned about this double album is that it actually has a number of outtakes on it from previous recording sessions, because when the band had finished all of the material they wrote for this album, it would have been a 3-sided album. So they included enough outtakes to fill out 4 sides and just make it a double album. And first of all, that's really noticeable because there are some throwaways on this album, but the last 3 songs, this is where these songs are obviously outtakes. They are obviously songs we just shouldn't have heard. Boogie with Stu is terrible. It's one of my least favorite Led Zeppelin songs. Black Country Woman is just a stupid joke song. It doesn't feel like the band was taking themselves seriously here at all. And it's not really funny. It doesn't really add anything to the album. And Sick Again is sick. In a bad way. Not it's sick, but it's sick. The lyrics to this song, you just don't want to look up. And, maybe there are a few tracks throughout the Led Zeppelin catalog that are like that. But this one especially. It's revolting. And it's not like the song musically is that strong either. It kind of sounds messy, but it would have been more passable if not for the egregious lyrical content. While I love this band's music, I cannot condone the band. Jimmy Page, in particular, did some really heinous stuff with underage girls. And the reason I'm bringing this up now is 1, because I should mention it anyway. But 2, because this song, Sick Again, is one of those moments where you can't separate that. I don't think he was the one who wrote these lyrics, but still, it's very gross. And this is the note the album ends on. And I think this is a big problem I have with Physical Graffiti. Most of the album is strong. It's fairly consistently good up until side D, but it's one thing to have some lesser tracks or some filler tracks on a double album or whatever, but they're all right at the end. This album just tanks so hard right at the end, and it makes it hard to look at the whole thing in as positive of a light. However, there are still tracks off of this that are very worthwhile songs for the band, and I'm glad that they're out there. This is a solid album. I just know that I have a lesser view of it than maybe many other people do. All that said, I still think it's probably a stronger album than Led Zeppelin III on the whole, and I would give it a 7.25 out of 10. And next up is the band's 1976 album Presence. So, as I said, Physical Graffiti marked the end of the band's classic run of albums, at least in my opinion. You wouldn't know it, though, from the start of Presence, which contains one of the band's most incredible, epic songs, Achilles' Last Stand. The song is so grand, and the pace of the song is just impressive. It's a 10-minute track, and it just never feels like it slows down. Every single member of the band is giving an all-timer performance on this track. It's spectacular. It's one of the band's best tracks. And to open the album with this song, I mean, that's just gotta mean that this is an epic album full of great ideas and amazing concepts and huge scale. And just by the way I'm saying this, you know I'm being sarcastic. This album is my least favorite Led Zeppelin album. Well, that depends on what you consider the Led Zeppelin canon, but we'll get to that later. Of the band's core studio albums, this is their worst, in my opinion. Because after Achilles' Last Stand, this album becomes soul-sucking, is probably how I'd describe it. I mean, it is so void of ideas or passion or heart. It feels like nobody tried or cared. Robert Plant is bad on most of this album. John Bonham is, serviceable. He's a good drummer, but he's not really given a lot to work with by Jimmy Page and John Paul Jones, who come together with some of the most boring riffs and bass lines of Led Zeppelin's career. This album is just bereft of quality. I think Nobody's Fault But Mine is the closest the album comes to getting a strong song, past Achilles' Last Stand, obviously. But even this song is pretty weak. It still just doesn't feel like there's heart in it. But that's especially the case for a song like For Your Life, which is probably the most creatively bankrupt Led Zeppelin song of all time. It is so dull. And on side 2 of this record, you get Hots On for Nowhere and Candy Store Rock. And either of these songs could honestly rank as my least favorite Led Zeppelin song. They are certainly in contention. They are extremely annoying tracks. I don't really know what went wrong. When you read into this album, you learn that Jimmy Page spent a ton of time in the studio recording overdubs, and I just have to wonder, where did that time go? Where did any of that time go? Was it all spent on Achilles' Last Stand? Because I could believe that. But for the rest of these songs, you're telling me there was a single member of this band that did more than one take for any of this album? I don't know. I don't know if I buy that. Compared to the string of albums that precedes it, there's no ambition to this album aside from the opening track. Anyway, I don't think this album is terrible. Led Zeppelin is too competent of a band, I think, at this point, to make something terrible. I mean, they make some terrible songs on this album and more. But overall, it isn't the worst thing ever. But it does suck, and I would give it a 4 out of 10. It is worth mentioning that the recording sessions were quite troubled for this album, and Robert Plant also recorded the vocals out of a wheelchair because he'd been in a car accident. The tragedy for the band continued after this record in multiple ways, and after all this turmoil for the band, they returned with 1979's In Through the Outdoor. I think this is the weirdest Led Zeppelin album. It's not weird in the way that Houses of the Holy is weird in places where it feels kind of artsy. It's weird because I don't know what they were trying to do. I don't know what the goal was here, or what the driving intention is behind this album. It really confuses me a lot. It's very bizarre. It's this weird blending of synths and AOR, but also Western country kind of sounds, but then also prog. And it's so weird. Now, reportedly, John Paul Jones was the creative vision behind this album more than anybody else. And John Paul Jones did play keyboards as well as bass for the band, so keys take a much, much bigger role on this album, which is unsurprising knowing that it was kind of his baby. But I don't even know what he was trying to do or what he was influenced by to make this album. And it's not just a weird album, it's also really stupid. It's really stupid. This album is so stupid. And for these reasons, I can get some things out of In Through the Outdoor, just because it's like such a weird train wreck. And it's not without its moments. You know, it has the radio singles Fool in the Rain and All My Love, which I think are both decent tracks. Fool in the Rain is a real experiment for the band, probably even more so than some of the genre experiments they underwent on Houses of the Holy, because the band like works samba into their sound. It's really odd, but it does work, although the song kind of goes on for like 2 minutes too long, but whatever, you know, it's a fine track. And I think All My Love sort of predates the hair metal power ballad in a way, which doesn't sound like a positive. It's not the biggest positive, you know, not my favorite kind of song, but I think they're ahead of the curve a little bit on this track. I think, you know, it's touching. But man, like outside of these songs, this album, the opener In the Evening is unbearable to me. Like I can't tolerate this song. It is 6 minutes of nightmarish musical material. The synth pad all over this song, combined with the annoying guitar riff, it is so grating. Like I can't stand it. And Robert Plant is doing the song no favors. And then like the second track, Southbound Soares, is just really stupid. Like maybe a more subtle band than Led Zeppelin could have pulled off this song just fine, but Led Zeppelin's not subtle. They just play the song too loud. And they do that with a lot of these songs. The band can't reconcile their volume with the kinds of things they were trying to do here, which is also a problem on the closer, I'm Gonna Crawl, which is a bizarre track. I mean, it's intense in a way I can kind of appreciate, but it's intense in moments where it feels like it maybe shouldn't be. Like, it's a strange track. The emotion of it is really muddled, but it almost kind of maybe sort of almost kind of works. But I cannot say the same for Hot Dog. I don't know. I can't even talk about the song without laughing. It's funny. Like, what is this? Why would they do this? Like, it's the stupidest song they ever did. Easily. It's so dumb. It's so dumb. It's like this weird country send-up. I think it's supposed to be a joke, sure. But I feel like I'm laughing at them when I listen to this song. And then you have the prog epic Carousel Ombra. I don't know, man. These synths. Oh, these synths. They sound so bad. Like, when you get to the third section of this song, it sounds like the penis music meme. You know, the penis music meme? That's what it sounds like. But you see, I'm sitting here having a good time discussing this album. It's funny. Like, this is a stupid album. It's stupid. It is ripe for sitting down with friends and listening to it and just laughing. It's a dumb, funny record. While I think it's totally fair to say this is their worst, and at one time I would have said that, I do appreciate how unabashedly dumb it is. Like, the band was surely aware of that with certain tracks here, and while I don't really think any of it works that well, it is a genuine experiment. It is an oddity, and there's a part of me that appreciates work like that. But the album still sucks. I would give it a 4.5 out of 10. Now, the band never made another studio record after In Through the Outdoor because drummer John Bonham tragically died in 1980. Unfortunately, tragedy really followed the band in these last few years, and we never really got to see what the band would do if they entered the 80s. I have to say, though, I think I don't really want to know what they would have done in the 80s given In Through the Outdoor. I do not think this band would have survived that decade. And I don't really need to hear a Led Zeppelin 80s era. That's just me, though. But they did put out one final album in 1982, which is Coda. Now, Coda is a compilation album. It's a compilation of outtakes and some live material dating all the way back to the Led Zeppelin II days. While the album does feature some overdubs and editing, it's not really a studio album, but the band released it as a studio album purely out of contractual obligations. So I'm talking about it because the album is considered a part of the band's main canon, and I'm not really here to dispute that. But, it's an outtakes compilation. And no surprise, it has a lot of bad tracks on it. It opens on We're Gonna Groove, which is a song the band would play in their live shows around the Led Zeppelin II era. It's a song that could have ended up on Led Zeppelin II. And just owing to how great of an album Led Zeppelin II is, this song is excellent. And it also just features a groove that doesn't really sound like something from 1969. It sounds a little bit ahead of the curve. Like, I would have expected this to have come out of, like, the later 70s. Though you can kind of tell, like, it's an edited version of a live track, because there are certain aspects of the mix that sound a little bit weird. And while I'm talking about the positives here, I also really enjoy the live rendition of I Can't Quit You Baby. I think this live version is honestly better than the version that lands on Led Zeppelin I. It just has more power and loudness to it. It has more force. For me, on the Led Zeppelin I track list, this song is a little bit of a lull, but on this album, it's easily a highlight. And I mean, that could just be because the rest of this material, outside of what I just talked about, is not very good. If we are counting this as a Led Zeppelin studio album, then this is actually my least favorite. I do think it's weaker than Presence, because the rest of these outtakes are, they're not great. We have Poor Tom, which is an outtake from Led Zeppelin III. It sounds like an outtake, It sounds like a kind of jammy folk tune, and the production on it's pretty bad, which is weird because most of the songs in Led Zeppelin III sound pretty damn good. It's like the middle of Coda, where things really go off the rails, because you get a Houses of the Holy outtake, Walter's Walk, which is abominable. I mean, it is terrible. The mix on this song, horrendous. It's so grating. Robert Plant's vocals, they make me want to stab my ears. But then the rest of the outtakes come from the In Through the Outdoor sessions. These songs were not good enough for In Through the Outdoor. Darlene, Ozone Baby, Wearing and Tearing, Bonzo's Montreux. It's not pretty. Darlene is extremely annoying. Wearing and Tearing is also kind of grating. It just sounds out of touch. Like it's like a really fast rockin' tune, but the riff is kind of stupid. And then you get Ozone Baby, which is a total throwaway. Like, even by the standards of In Through the Outdoor, this song is a total throwaway, which is probably why it didn't land on that album. I think it's nice that this album exists. It gives Led Zeppelin fans a place to have all of these outtakes, and I think that's nice. It also serves as another album if you're really dying for another Led Zeppelin album after In Through the Outdoor. But actually listening to the thing, it's just not great. It's a mixed bag in some ways. Like, there are some positives to it. But the middle stretch of this album is pretty hard to sit through. I'd give this another 4 out of 10. Like, I don't think Led Zeppelin really ever made a terrible record, but they certainly have made some terrible tracks, and some of them land on Coda. Anyway, that is their entire studio discography. And I think, it was fun to go through these albums. I hope you enjoyed it too. While the last few records were not good, it's still a pretty cool discography to go through for the most part. I mean, really, like, this band made a lot of classic albums, and I think that their run from their debut album up to Physical Graffiti is an all-timer run in all of rock music. It really is. Like, all of those albums could be called classics, and you have various people arguing that any one of those records is their best record. And that's something that not a lot of artists can tout, so, props to Led Zeppelin for that. I think the band's legacy is complicated, and there are a lot of discussions to be had around it that are kind of outside of the scope of this video, where I just want to review the work itself. Anyway, I hope I was able to justify my love for this band in this video. Let me know in the comments what your opinion on their discography is and where it differs from mine and what kinds of things you agree and disagree with me on. And if you could please like this video and subscribe if you are not subscribed, I don't think you'll regret that. Because not too long after I upload this video, I'm going to follow it up with a songs tier list of all Led Zeppelin songs with my friend Teeterman Can, similar to the Beatles song tier list we did last year. If you were here to see a Led Zeppelin video, you can go now. For my subscribers, I would just like to say I apologize for the lack of content. I understand that whole The Music Breakdown Live thing was a bit of an experiment for the channel, and I know a lot of you did enjoy it, but it wasn't really fulfilling for me to make, and I feel like I owed my audience more. And so I highly doubt that show as a live show is going to continue, at least in the form that it was in. But I think a lot of the things I would do on that stream, such as tier lists and more, simplistic content like that stuff, still has a place in this channel. And what I'd like to do going forward, if I can, is do videos like this, these full videos that feel more produced than that content, and intersperse those with that easier content like the tier list and stuff like that, because I think that stuff's good, I think that stuff's fun, but when it's the only stuff on the channel, that's certainly not enough in my opinion. So we'll try that going forward, and yeah, I guess I'll see you next time. I don't intend to be on a hiatus that long for the near future. I'd like to really get back to this channel and do things you want to see. My focus is going to be on doing discography type videos, whether those be worst to bests, tier list, retrospectives. Those kinds of things I think have always been the most successful for my channel, and I think it's really been what's defined my channel, even though it was never supposed to be originally. As for like singular album reviews, I don't know. We'll see. Anyway, that's a lot of extra information for this Led Zeppelin video, but I do hope you enjoyed it, and I will see you next time.